Tiger and Tom. The day was pleasant, in that particularly pleasant part of summertime, which the boys call vacation, when Tiger and Tom walked slowly down the street together. You may think it strange that I mentioned Tiger first, but I assure you, Tom would not have been in the least offended by the preference. Indeed, he would have told you that Tiger was the most wonderful dog, and knew as much as any two boys, though this might be called extravagant. Nearly a year ago, on Tom's birthday, Tiger arrived as a present from Tom's uncle, and as the dog leapt with a dignified bound from the wagon in which he had made his journey, Tom looked for a moment into his great, wise eyes, and impulsively threw his arms around his shaggy neck. Tiger was pleased with Tom's bright face, and affectionately licked his smooth cheeks. So the league of friendship was complete in an hour. Tom had a pleasant round face, and you might live with him a week and think him one of the noblest, most generous boys you ever knew. But some day you would probably discover that he had a most violent temper. You would be frightened to see his face crimson with rage, as he stamped his feet, shook his little sister, spoke improperly to his mother, and above all, displeased his great Father in heaven. Now I am going to tell you of something which happened to Tom, on this account, which he never forgot to the end of his life. Tiger and Tom were walking down the street together one pleasant day, when they met Dick Casey, a schoolfellow of Tom's. "Oh, Dick," cried Tom, "I'm going to Father's grain store a little while. Let's go up in the loft and play." Dick had just finished his work in his mother's garden, and was ready for a little amusement. So the two went up in the loft together, and enjoyed themselves for a long time. But at last, one of those trifling disputes arose, in which little boys are so apt to indulge. Pretty soon there were angry words, and then, oh, how sorry I am to say it, Tom's wicked passions got the mastery of him, and he beat little Dick severely. Tiger, who must have been ashamed of his master, pulled hard at his coat, and whined piteously. But all in vain. At last Tom stopped, from mere exhaustion. "There now," he cried. "Which is right, you or I?" "I am," sobbed Dick, "and you tell a lie." Tom's face became crimson, and darting upon Dick he gave him a sudden push. Alas, he was near to the open door. Dick screamed, threw up his arms, and in a moment was gone. Tom's heart stood still, and an icy chill crept over him from head to foot. At first he could not stir. Then, he never knew how he got there, but he found himself standing beside his little friend. Some men were raising him carefully from the hard sidewalk. "Is he dead?" almost screamed Tom. "No," replied one. "We hope not. How did he fall out?" "He didn't fall," groaned Tom, who never could be so mean as to tell a lie. "I pushed him out." "You pushed him, you wicked boy," cried a rough voice. "Do you know you ought to be sent to jail? And if he dies, maybe you'll be hung." Tom grew as white as Dick, whom he had followed into the store, and he heard all that passed as if in a dream. "Is he badly hurt?" cried someone. "Only his hands," was the answer. "The rope saved him. He caught hold of the rope and slipped down, but his hands are dreadfully torn. He has fainted from pain." Just then Tom's father came in, and soon understood the case. The look he gave his unhappy son so full of sorrow, not unmingled with pity, was too much for Tom, and he stole out, followed by the faithful tiger. He wandered to the woods and threw himself upon the ground. 1 hour ago he was a happy boy, and now what a terrible change. What had made the difference? Nothing but the indulgence of his wicked, violent temper. His mother had often warned him of the fearful consequences. She had told him that little boys who would not learn to govern themselves grew up to be very wicked men, and often became murderers in some moment of passion. And now, Tom shuddered to think he was almost a murderer. Nothing but God's great mercy in putting that rope in Dick's way had saved him from carrying that load of sorrow and guilt all the rest of his life. But poor Dick might die yet. How pale he looked! How strange! Tom fell upon his knees and prayed God to spare Dick's life. And from that time forth, with God's help, he promised that he would strive to conquer his wicked temper. Then, as he could no longer bear his terrible suspense, he started for Widow Casey's cottage. As he appeared at the humble door, Mrs. Casey angrily ordered him away, saying, "You have made a poor woman trouble enough for one day." But Dick's feeble voice entreated, "Oh, mother, let him come in. I was just as bad as he." Tom gave a cry of joy at hearing these welcome tones, and sprang hastily in. There sat poor Dick, with his hands bound up, looking very pale. But Tom thanked God that he was alive. "I should like to know how I am to live now," sighed Mrs. Casey. "Who will weed the garden and carry my vegetables to market? I am afraid we shall suffer for bread before the summer is over." And she put her apron to her eyes. "Mrs. Casey," cried Tom eagerly, "I will do everything that Dick did. I will sell the cabbages, potatoes, and beans, and will drive Mr. Brown's cows to pasture." Mrs. Casey shook her head incredulously. But Tom bravely kept his word. For the next few weeks, Tom was at his post bright and early, and the garden was never kept in better order. Every morning Tiger and Tom stood faithfully in the marketplace with their baskets, and never gave up, no matter how warm the day, till the last vegetable was sold, and the money placed faithfully in Mrs. Casey's hand. Tom's father often passed through the market, and gave his little son an encouraging smile. But he did not offer to help him out of his difficulty, for he knew if Tom struggled on alone, it would be a lesson he would never forget. Already he was becoming so gentle and patient that everyone noticed the change, and his mother rejoiced over the sweet fruits of his repentance and self-sacrifice. After a few weeks, the bandages were removed from Dick's hands, but they had been unskillfully treated, and were drawn up in very strange shapes. Mrs. Casey could not conceal her grief. "He will never be the help he was before," she said to Tom. "He will never be like other boys, and he wrote such a fine hand. Now he can no more make a letter than that little chicken in the garden." "If we only had a great city doctor," said a neighbor, "he might have been all right. Even now his fingers might be helped if you should take him to New York." "Oh, I'm too poor, said she, and burst into tears. Tom could not bear it, and again rushed into the woods to think what could be done, for he had already given them all his quarter's allowance. All at once a thought flashed into his head, and he started as if he had been shot. Then he cried in great distress, "No, no, anything but that! I can't do that." Tiger gently licked his hands and watched him with great concern. Now came a terrible struggle. Tom paced back and forth, and although he was a proud boy, he sobbed aloud. Tiger whined, licked Tom's face, rushed off into dark corners, and barked savagely at some imaginary enemy, and then came back, and putting his paws on his young master's knees, wagged his tail in anxious sympathy. At last Tom took his hands from his pale, tear-stained face, and looking into the dog's great, honest eyes, he cried with a queer shake in his voice, "Tiger, old fellow, dear old dog, could you ever forgive me if I sold you?" Then came another burst of sorrow, and Tom rose hastily, as if afraid to trust himself, and almost ran out of the woods. Over the fields he raced, with Tiger close at his heels, nor rested a moment till he stood at Major White's door, nearly 2 miles away. "Do you still want Tiger, sir?" "Why, yes," said the old man in great surprise. "But it can't be possible that you want to sell him, do you, my boy?" And the kind old gentleman gave Tom a quick, questioning glance. "Yes, please," gasped Tom, not daring to look at his old companion. The exchange was quickly made, and the $10 in Tom's hand. Tiger was beguiled into a barn, the door hastily shut, and Tom was hurrying off, when he turned and cried in a choking voice, "You will be kind to him, Major White, won't you? Don't whip him. I never did, and he's the best dog." "No, no, child," said Major White kindly. "I'll treat him like a prince, and if you ever want to buy him back, you shall have him." Tom managed to falter, "Thank you," and almost flew out of hearing of Tiger's eager scratching on the barn door. I am making my story too long, and can only tell you in a few words that Tom's sacrifice was accepted. A friend took little Dick to the city, free of expense, and Tom's money paid for the necessary operation. The poor, crooked fingers were very much improved, and were soon almost as good as ever. And the whole village loved Tom for his brave, self-sacrificing spirit, and the noble atonement he had made for his moment of passion. A few days after Dick's return came Tom's birthday. But he did not feel in his usual spirits. In spite of his delight in Dick's recovery, he had so mourned over the matter, and had taken Tiger's loss so much to heart, that he had grown quite pale and thin. So as he was allowed to spend the day as he pleased, he took his books and went to his favorite haunt in the woods. He lay down under the shade of a wide, spreading maple, and buried his face in his hands. "How different from my last birthday," thought Tom. "Then Tiger had just come, and I was so happy, though I didn't like him half as well as I do now." Tom sighed heavily, then added more cheerfully, "Well, I hope some things are better than they were last year. I hope I have begun to conquer myself, and with God's help I will never give up trying while I live. But oh, how much sorrow and misery I have made for myself, as well as for others, by only once giving way to my wicked, foolish temper. And not only that, but," added Tom with a sigh, "I can never forget that I might have been a murderer, had it not been for the mercy of God. Now if I could only earn money enough to buy back dear old Tiger." While Tom was busied with these thoughts, he heard a hasty, familiar trot, a quick bark of joy, and the brave old dog sprang into Tom's arms. "Tiger, old fellow," cried Tom, trying to look fierce, though he could scarcely keep down the tears. "How came you to run away, sir?" Tiger responded by picking up a letter he had dropped in his first joy and laying it in Tom's hand. My dear child, Tiger is pining, and I must give him a change of air. I wish him to have a good master, and knowing that the best ones are those who have learned to govern themselves, I send him to you. Will you take care of him and oblige your old friend, Major White? Tom then read through a mist of tears. P.S. I know the whole story, dear young friend. Be not weary in well-doing.